Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Professor Z. Motsamadikane. I'm the Vice Principal for Teaching, Learning, Community Engagement, and Student Support. I shall be presiding over this phenomenal, prodigious occasion of the University of South Africa, the inaugural lecture. Before we proceed, I wish to pay my respects to the following people. To Professor Puleng Lenkabula, the Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of South Africa. To Prof. Vilnkomo, the Executive Dean of the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs. To our inaugurant, Professor Armageza Barthel, Professor of Peace and Development Studies in the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs. I also wish to recognize the respondent, our respondent, Prof. M.H. Marchand, who is associated with quite a number of international universities in Mexico, Canada, and Germany. I wish to also recognize the presence of Professor Mageza Barthel's family in attendance. Colleagues, students, and all of you ladies and gentlemen, you are welcome. This is an inaugural lecture, and some of you may wonder what this is. Let me just explain a little what we mean by inaugural lectures. In essence, today we gather here to honor eminence in scholarship, as exhibited by Prof. Mageza Barthel. An inaugural lecture, ladies and gentlemen, is the highest peak in the academic journey. It is the point of becoming a full professor. It is therefore fitting for us to call it the rite of passage in one's academic journey. It is the culmination of many, many years of dedication and hard work. I am very delighted to be presiding over this momentous journey of the scholar we're celebrating today. I was just looking through the work that she shall be talking about, and I was teased to think about issues of political histories, issues of peace in the African continent as well as in the international space. Indeed, these are matters that touch us most as human beings. I will not go into the lecture. We have the honor of the professor herself in presenting this lecture. So for now, I think it is important for us to move on as I call the Dean, Prof. Vilnkomo, to come forward. The Dean will introduce the scholar. After the scholar has presented her lecture, the respondent shall follow suit thereafter. Prof. Vilnkomo, this is your time. Please come forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Motsa. It is indeed an honor and privilege for me to introduce Professor Rerandu Mageza Patel. She is going to be presenting her inaugural lecture. Rerandu Mageza Patel holds the Professorship in Peace and Development Studies at the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs. She graduated with a doctoral degree in political studies from the University of Frankfurt in 2012. Her research focuses on the international relations of the Global South, with an emphasis on gender post-conflict transformation and African-Chinese relations. Prior to her appointment, Prof. Mageza Bartel held the chair for international gender politics at the University of Kassel and other positions in political studies and international development at universities in Germany and Austria. As an internationally active scholar with global experience, she has spent extended periods abroad. She was previously a guest researcher at the University of South Africa's Pre-Media Chair for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. She has also been a guest researcher at Syracuse University in the United States, Stellenbosch University, Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia, and the University of Rwanda in Rwanda. Professor Mageza Bartel's involvement in inter- and transdisciplinary research contexts has contributed to her successful teaching and supervision at both under and postgraduate levels in various degree programs. She currently serves on 2 prominent journals in her field, namely as an academic editor for Third World Quarterly and the editorial board of the International Feminist Journal of Politics, respectively. Both appear on the Scopus and Web of Science indices. She is further the co-editor of the Routledge book series, Gender in Global, Local, World. Prof. Mageza Bartel is the author of the monograph titled Mobilizing Transnational Gender Politics in Post-Genocide Rwanda, and has co-audited volumes Violence, War, Refuge, Feminist Perspectives on Security, African Transformations, Trans-Regional Perspectives on Development, Cooperation, Social Mobility, and Cultural Change, as well as Negotiating Normativity, Post-Colonial Appropriations, Contestations and Transformations. Her portfolio is complemented by service leadership positions in national and international professional associations, including the Chinese in Africa, Africans in China Research Network, the German Association of Political Science, and the International Studies Association. Ladies and gentlemen, I now have the pleasure to request and invite Professor Mageza Bartel to deliver her inaugural lecture.
Dear Nisans, dear esteemed colleagues and family, I greet and welcome you to today's lecture that marks a milestone in any academic's life. Thank you to the speakers before me, our Vice Principal, Professor Mutsa Madikane, and the Executive Dean of our college, Professor Willem, for the kind introduction and the opportunity to speak on this occasion. I would also like to thank Professor Marianne Marchand. We are, and I am, extremely fortunate to have her in our midst during her own transatlantic travels, which puts us in the rare situation of being in the same time zone to respond to my talk today. This occasion marks, Professor Mutsa Madikane and Professor Willem, the ceremonial admission into the professoriate. Being appointed as a tenured full professor denotes the apex of an academic career. It is a final rung of a ladder whose foundation is built well before our individual academic entry into the hallways of universities. Because we are on the topic of celebration, may I take this occasion to also wish you a happy Women's Month as it nears its end, and to acknowledge all of my family members in South Africa, in Germany, and in other parts of the world. In their midst are several people, with us and departed, whose birthdays lie in August. I scheduled this occasion around them and express my gratitude to them. Since I joined UNISA last year, I have been fortunate to contribute to the building of the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, of which this occasion marks a milestone. It is thus not merely a personal occasion, but one of the school too. During this period, I have come to know many colleagues and have been able to explore the South African higher education system that I had been in touch with on many occasions, but had formally left 20 years prior. It is a return to a university whom I first met upon in the form of envelopes with completed assignments in West Germany. That was a very different world, and it seems like it's worlds apart from this one. The world as we know it seems to be at a point where we focus and where few of us can ignore the rumble of change taking place beneath the surface. Our school's persuasion that there can be no peace without development and no development without peace speaks to the core of peace and conflict studies as we encounter it today. With the advent of pluricrises, we are reminded that we live in extremely uncertain times. The world is constituted by a multitude of interrelating conflict lines that also find their expression in gender relations. Our country is going through a period of steep economic challenges to which the regular and debilitating manifestation of load shedding has created a parallel economy. Our universities face annual upheavals, reminding us of the socioeconomic stratification within our country. And globally, the knock-on effects of not-so-distant wars and the dangers of socio-ecological crises produce the real threat of an Anthropocene and have reached our shores to burden our citizens even further. This can, therefore, not be regarded as a singular or linear event, as times would suggest. It rather finds itself as the expression of an inhospitable environment in which the context demands a levy of success and fashions the paradox of conducting business as usual in an unusual world. Against this backdrop, it is neither possible to present solutions, be they comprehensive or even pointed, nor is it desirable to attempt to do this from our position. In a nutshell, the domain and concern of peace and conflict studies are the factors and consequences of instability, where, in a literal sense, this demands some response in terms of a quest for tranquility, either as alternatives to the status quo that led to the normalisation of armed conflict, or as visions of a new world to come. Currently, as we recently celebrated our 150th anniversary as a university, we stand on the cusp of national elections as a country and will be marking the anniversary of 1994 as a most significant event for the continent. These were and are all moments through which the possibilities of a new era, of new developments, and of new debates should galvanize. For the past couple of years, I have focused on the ideational dimensions of peace, politics, and development. These stand next to and interlock with the material dimensions of peace and indigenous knowledges that have been brought into our focus area of peace and conflict studies. There are a couple of things to note as I begin this talk. It is no doubt easy to romanticize the past or the local, in as much as it is to fall into the trap of an essentialism regarding women in society. It is a warning that we heed as we strive to celebrate our successes and face up to the challenges. It is their bodies and their service to society that is targeted for placing them in seats of power, as adorning the images of independence, progress, and development, or as forming the proverbial battlegrounds of patriarchy. What is too often left behind is their minds or contributions to our discursive practices and our existing epistemologies. The African and international developments I employ in the subtitle is an acknowledgement of Africa as a continent and the global setting of Africans. It refers to the shifts of peace and conflict studies within which their involvement is identified. We are all aware of the many conflicts raging on the African continent. Less known are the efforts at attaining sustainable peace as they are tied to emancipatory endeavors. Our Chancellor and former President is well known, like Jimmy Carter in the United States and our many Nobel Peace Laureates before him, for being a beacon of peace in our country and on the continent. On an institutional and organizational level, we have also been able to observe the transformation of the Organization of African Unity into the African Union. We are keenly aware and awaiting the peace dividends that the promise in this century is meant to usher in. Here, I seek to reflect women's, and more specifically, feminist contributions in the body of theory in the field of peace and development studies, for which I outline the related areas. A proposition that guides this is that the international is inextricably linked to the local as much as the past is to the present. Throughout this lecture, I employ gender in various ways, whereas my empirical gaze takes me to the social category of women. I also acknowledge the contribution by many of the people I mentioned towards feminist knowledge production. They themselves have not been able to self-identify as such. More so, I would like to emphasize that there is a certain historicity to the reference of gender that I employ. None of the writing here, or the issues I will be reflecting on, would have been possible without queer activism and allied struggles for freedom as part of the overall emancipatory movements I refer to. So to bring this to the current day, the question should be, are our archives complete without feminist knowledges? And conversely, are our feminist archives complete without the acknowledgement of African feminisms as steeped in global conflicts? It takes a certain idealism in a learned sense to appreciate why the global system remains of value to those of us aspiring for a more just world and constructively taking stock of its anarchic nature. For much of my previous work, I was inspired by and took sustenance from a perspective that was gleaned from the South African experience of transformation. Even such a debilitating and protracted oppressive system as ours pre-1994 could be followed by hope. Today, much of that has changed, and there has been a loss of this fundamental virtue, as well as society-wide disillusionment with where we find ourselves. The political histories and struggles for peace I speak of today are questions that should not be relegated to libraries or classrooms. This is therefore my invitation to you to introduce yourself to me as I'm introducing myself to you now, to inform and inspire me as I seek to teach and educate others, to question and reflect with me as we seek to innovate, to co-create, and to democratize the highly stratified global society we live in. With this said, allow me to take you on a journey of political histories and struggles for peace. I offer a retrospective analysis and reflections to show that in histories that are also always political, we would only have a partial view of international affairs, peace studies, and development studies if we do not include gender and feminisms in them. The same applies if we do so only as a social rather than a political category. We lose sight of why these fields are transformative. My lecture is divided into 3 substantive sections. Following this introduction, I move on to section 2, titled On the Necessity of an Equality and Equity-Oriented Peace and Conflict Studies. It covers the 3 topics and subsections on eternal peace or perpetual conflict, critical perspectives on peace, development, conflict in Africa, as well as feminist genealogies of peace and security. I then proceed to section 3 on epistemic justice for peace and development, in which I appeal to revisiting the archives. This leads to section 4 on peace junctures and their legacies. To close, I offer concluding remarks to hand over to our respondent for further reflection. II, on the necessity of an equality and equity-oriented peace and conflict studies. Peace, security, and development belong to the buzzwords of our times. With the number of conflicts we have witnessed on our continent and with the global shifts in warfare that have marked the terrain of armed conflicts in the last century, the insecurity of states and people have increased rather than decreased. New technologies and the widespread everyday use of these across society and our reliance on connectivity for simple as well as central functions in the economy have left people more vulnerable to virtual attacks and fluctuations across the board. The breakdown of global value chains in almost all economic sectors, and particularly in the health sector during the COVID pandemic, made evident how contingent normalcy is and how interdependent we actually are. As we all know, peace is not endemic, nor the natural state in which society exists. The recurring nature of conflicts and the fragility of negotiated peace settlements only confirms what may have been a suspicion among many. More pointedly, and to speak to the values we adhere to, how can one not be interested in any of these aims, or aim to achieve them on any given day? In the following, I will continue with discussions concerning peace, security, and development that have contributed to an equality and equity-oriented peace and conflict studies. So let us now turn to the topic of eternal peace or eternal conflict. Cursory glances at liberal debates. Debates in peace and conflict studies, considered to be classic, have been shaped by authors and events that have had a global impact, if not origin, and have been able to cross language, regional, and cultural barriers. Unlike international relations, which saw its origin mainly as a body of knowledge in service of the state, peace and conflict studies has a more eclectic foundation. It may be difficult to distinguish and differentiate between the fields of peace, conflict, and security studies because they are often referred to interchangeably, because they are also closely related in the theoretical ancestry they share, and because of the institutional setting within universities that they often find themselves in. A glance at some issues reveals what makes peace studies distinct. Apart from the different kinds of peace, peace studies incorporate such topics as social justice movements, conflict dynamics, resistance and democracy, reconciliation, disarmament, nonviolence, peacekeeping, peacebuilding, and peacemaking, cultures of violence, cultural approaches to peace, and cultures of sustainable peace. It extends to governance and nation building, rights discourses, and peace beyond the state, and further entails analyses of violence and armed conflict, warfare and terrorism, regionalization and international institutions. These are but a few of the issues germane to the field. Many scholars who have found themselves on the battlefield and in military service have provided insight into the nature, dimensions, and dynamics of armed conflict that have shaped the field and perceptions thereof. Among these, we need only mention Karl von Clausewitz on war, or the popular Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince that has made it into many a business strategy bookshelf. Their analysis, if not celebration of violence, armed conflict and war, as central to organizing society, has made a unique contribution to the humanities and social sciences. The force of destruction that perpetual and recurring armed conflicts had impressed other scholars to the extent that they mainly reflected on their conclusion and what they thought ought to follow. Clausewitz wrote against the backdrop of the Napoleonic Wars. Immanuel Kant's To Perpetual Peace may not have come into being without the legacy of the 30-Year War, and Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, similar to Herfried Münkler's The New Wars, grew out of the end of the Cold War and concerns of how different entities and regions would seek to dominate each other. Finally, Romeo Dallaire's Shake Hands with the Devil was a response to the new kind of warfare he witnessed and the United Nations' failure in light of a genocide in Rwanda, after having proclaimed never again since the organization's establishment as a direct consequence of World War II. The predominant debates on how to evade a perpetual conflict, the looming World War III we are all still anxious about, and to pursue an eternal peace were inspired by these very considerations. In a liberal approach, they asked how power can be exercised and how the imbalance of power could be mitigated. They responded under the impression that the Cold War had seen the victory of capitalism on the one hand and the triumph of democracy on the other. This impression was not just shared among scholars, but became the principal consideration among practitioners and global institutions. The UN issued its Agenda for Peace in 1992 along these lines and differentiated between peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peacebuilding. Bretton Woods institutions supported programs that encouraged countries to become more democratic, and development agencies in the global north began mainstreaming peace and strengthened civil society as oppositional forces to autocratic governments in the global south. Such a defense of democracy in practice coincided with the third wave of democratization that we here, and also in this country, were all privy to, and the resurgence in the same era of democratic peace theory derived from the Kantian perspective that loosely posits that democratic states do not wage wars against each other. It hinged on a new period of statehood ushered in by the Peace of Westphalia, which saw a reordering of international borders created. So this was a take-home concerning interstate wars. In terms of domestic conflicts or intrastate conflicts, state building in a general sense was influenced by the idea that the unchecked existence of difference and social diversity would lead not merely to a competition for the reins of the state and its coffers, but also to the discrimination of minorities and instability in the body politic. It implied that diversity and pluralism had to be managed through political frameworks and legal mechanisms, such as constitutions. This impacted precisely those states undergoing democratization experiments. The leviathan of those states, whose governments were regarded with suspicion, needed to be tamed and reined in. Internal orders were designed to avoid perceived causes of conflicts, such as ethnicity, that had to be mitigated through federalist demarcations, for example. This takes me to the critical perspectives on peace, development, conflict, and Africa. Not surprisingly, this worldview encountered much protest from different directions. On a factual level, the end of the Cold War, there was a conflict between ideological systems, did not end wars in general. There's been a flurry of armed conflicts. Their shifting nature has meant that they affected people more directly and differently. And since then, we have seen wars not only between Russia and the Ukraine, but there's also still a demilitarized zone between North and South Korea that separates the two states, similar to the Berlin Wall between the two German states. We have peacekeepers in the United Nations-led missions that are stationed in 12 conflict zones, many of which have been conflicts spanning several decades, and almost half of them being on the African continent. Compared to the 65 countries that were recipients of the Peacebuilding Fund in 2022 alone, it indicates that the key difference between negative and positive peace, as conceived by Johann Galtung, guides the international agenda. Also, with the insight that peace requires building between people rather than states. The nexus of peace and development studies are located within this critical scholarship. The shift in emphasis lies therein that the topics mentioned above are viewed under institutions demarcating the structural nature of the global and local environment, as well as people, who amid poverty and the political economy of violence, act as agents of change. Critical scholarship has sought to change the nature of the discourse and make them more relevant to Africa in large and South Africa specifically. For the global South, on a figurative level, the Peace of Westphalia, similar to the Berlin Conference, signaled the introduction of the figure Europe. With it, the modern state system held not only a promise of peace, but more accurately, an assurance of organized domination and international intervention. Only few African states and others belonging to the periphery were able to resist humanitarian aid or the effects of doctrines and policies in the name of upholding peace and democracy. The wars in Iraq or the former Yugoslavia, for instance, were embarked on with a figure of human rights and democracy employed, or to arrest the crumbling of an obsolete state. Much of the scholarship referred to previously was about peace and conflict in the global south, but, as critical perspectives highlight, it had essentially not taken the global south on board, beyond being an empty canvas or peculiar. The goalposts for peace in practice have in the meantime shifted from one predominated by mere armistices and peace agreements between warring factions to one in which a more stable foundation for societal development needs to occur. To take the argument further, liberal approaches did not quite change the image of Africa or other parts of the global south that was the foundation for some of the assumptions drawn earlier. For far too long, Africa continues to exist as a trope, whereas the continent also inspires global change. For the continent, as for the region more generally, the legacies of colonialism and coloniality are a reality. And here I refer to Valentine Mudimbe, Achille Mbembe, and Mukenge's Shai Matata's work. If we draw on the arguments made by Tim Moriti as a scholar of African knowledge systems about African indigenous and endogenous approaches to peace and conflict resolution, then official state and international peace processes in Africa are neither exotic, isolated, nor parochial, but rather a nexus of the global and the local. As he defines for us, and I quote, "The term indigenous refers to that which is inherent to a given society, but also that which is innate and instinctive. The term endogenous refers to that which emerges from a society." This distinction becomes relevant when we ask, what is an African peace and conflict studies? Or where might different ideas around peace stem from? Is it merely an agenda or program that is imposed to us by others? Or may it be sourced within own practices, traditions, and approaches? The answer is very often provided with reference to Ubuntu in the transitional justice frameworks of South Africa, as elaborated by Archbishop Tutu. Or, for instance, as an alternative to development, as discussed by Sally Matthews. That there may be a collection of African, if not Southern approaches to peace, is articulated by Sabelo Ndlovu Gacheni and Busani Ngcaweni when they argue that African humanism, espoused by leaders such as Mandela, Kaunda, Nyerere, Césaire, and Senghor, were peace paradigms and stood in opposition to war as a mode of politics. We need only refer and recall Clausewitz's definition of war as politics by other means to receive the theoretical intervention. They summarize emphatically, and I quote again, "The paradigm of peace is therefore inextricably linked with decoloniality. It is made possible by the decolonial turn." End quote. Capturing the theoretical and cultural approaches to peace is one way of restoring the blank canvas that has contributed to the image of a continent constantly at war. Another is through showing how Africans as individuals, networks, organizations, and states have in practice participated in global endeavors. This is achieved through the task of historiography, to which I will turn later. Here it's to note that Siphamandla Zondi has, among other authors, written about the African National Congress relations with solidarity and peace movements within the SADC project that provides a consistent series of contributions thematically arranged in South Africa's past. Such a compilation is not merely a collection, but may be regarded as an intervention in and of itself. it may be assigned to different schools and cover various issues. One of these areas, which Wessel-Visser assumes under the revisionist school, owing to its socio-cultural focus alongside history making with regards to memory and heritage studies, is that of gender studies, to which I turn next in the form of feminist genealogies of peace and security. Feminist scholarship is not generically radical, as one may be led to believe from the systematization provided above. Instead, it may in itself be divided into different theoretical strands, such as liberal, socialist, Marxist, and radical feminism. Moreover, it exists in and draws from different disciplines to make up what I would summarize as a feminist contribution to peace and conflict studies. These are briefly international relations, development studies, and peace, respectively, security studies. Common to the various feminisms in the plural is their focus on gender as a social construct and increasingly revoking the dichotomy between the genders. Whereas Marxist scholars emphasize class as the preferred unit of analysis, intersectional perspectives highlight gender, class, and race, as well as other categories of social difference, with reference to Kimberly Crenshaw. And taken as a flip side thereof, transversal perspectives focus on how these social categories act together, using a phrase coined by Neera Yuval Davis. As these strands stand in dialogue with one another, they also speak with the scholarship of those schools not privileging for gender for analytical purposes. African feminisms also reflect the fluid movement between disciplines and subdisciplines among peace and conflict scholars. Already early on, scholars such as Sheila Meintjes, Anu Pillay, and Meredith Tertian, and Amina Mama and Marga Okazawa-Ray, as well as Funmi Olonisakin, Karen Barnes, and Eka Ikpe, brought together various African or Africanist scholars. Among them were feminist activists and politicians such as Yaliwe Clark Nozizwe Malala Rutledge or Helen Scanlon, named here as they were or are located in South Africa. Some of the lessons and contributions that may be taken from the field of international relations towards feminist peace and conflict studies broadly is that gender is a constitutive factor of international politics and may not be regarded as an additive component. That because of gender and how it informs the international system, there is a relational perspective and there is a loop between different spheres of politics. And that despite the international dimensions, there is a situatedness of knowledge too. The feminist contributions that have been most conducive towards African peace and conflict studies may primarily be identified in the wide field of development, within which I also count post-colonial and decolonial perspectives. For one, with the distinction between high and low politics, the latter of which is the area in which women are prevalent. For another, because the focus on social dynamics and theory building for and with the global South, it is the area in which feminist theories concerning Africa are articulated. And finally, peace and conflict studies is a rather heterogeneous field that is fairly recently elaborating on gendered relations and forms of violence. A political history of feminisms in the plural reveals that although localized as struggles, they address global forces that affect them as women and as Southern women specifically, owing to the North-South relations and how, either because of or despite of their gender, they are left and let into these systems. With reference to Chandra Talpadi Mohanty, or our Respondent and Ansys in Runyon, these structural systems and asymmetries, as well as the legacies of colonialism, are counted as manifestations of capitalism in its globalized form. They are also counted in the form of coalition building and calls for sisterhood as political products thereof. divergent interpretations and instrumentalizations, please excuse me, of the human rights agenda led to the sanctioning of military interventions in the name of peace, or in many other instances, the defiance of accepted global norms and standards that demarcate the boundaries of the acceptable, the normative, and the intelligible, as we have argued elsewhere. Newer feminist edited collections include Anna Chitando, whose continent-wide focus on peacebuilding is captured. Tarja Varinen et al. Concentrated on feminist insights that twinned peace with justice. Lastly, I, together with a collective of other feminist scholars, reintroduced transdisciplinarity back into political studies regarding violence, war, and security. We variously brought the Global South and Africa into conversation with peace and conflict studies once more. In our introduction, we argued, and I would like to summarize this also because the last volume I mentioned was a bilingual publication, that gender remains rendered invisible because women's predominant perception as naturally peaceable, passive victims of armed violence, grieving mothers and wives of soldiers, or as peacemakers, robs them of the agency and differentiated analysis as actors involved in international security politics to claim as their own, as soldiers in state armies, in non-state troops, or as supporters of armed conflict and activists against war, but also in post-conflict societies. A gender lens, we maintained, lends a new appreciation of and differentiates how armed conflict, violence, and war affect men and women. While we directed the publication primarily at a German-speaking audience who would equally access the English contributions within the volume, we explicitly highlighted the transnational embeddedness of feminist debates as it was expressed through women of color and Black feminists, indigenous feminists, and queer feminisms to question the singularity of gender. Conversely, power relations and relations of domination receive a new quality when regarded through the global political economy and international politics of inequality and difference. To this we counted, since 9/11 in particular, the securitization of policies and discourses otherwise far-flung from security concerns. We primarily identified overlaps between feminist peace and security studies because they questioned key dichotomies in political studies such as peace and war, private and public, security and insecurity, to name but a few, because of their proximity to emancipatory social movements, and because they critique the multiple relations of domination and theoretical gaps caused through the omission of gender within them. We have seen, as a part of these overall feminist genealogies on peace and security, how in Africa and beyond, militarism and militarization come to light alongside those of US imperialism. By their very definition and their very globally encompassing nature, they also give rise to global yet situated solidarities. Moreover, peace in an international system may not be conceived of without paying attention to the movement of people and the existence of diasporic communities who are predominantly located locally. The connectedness, in my view, with reference to Roseanne Liu and Savannah Shange, as well as Sachio Tsukamoto, lends meaning to such ideas as thick solidarity that gives rise to social stability by bringing together empathy, activism, and global peace. These are the concerns with which I embark on in my current discussion. For a South African and African audience, I would underscore that chief among the critique is the extent to which the existing gendered rescue narrative perpetuates other human and man-made, social inequalities and exclusions. The result being that women, and among women and those gendered as female, it amplifies their status as being devoid of African agency along gendered, geopolitical, and racialized lines. Where this is not physically the case, it extends to the historically ingrained discursive patterns and social constructions on which these premises are built. Taken together, whilst it is complex to outline the feminist genealogies of peace, it is timely and serves to fill a gap experienced by scholars around the globe. It is a perspective, in some, that has largely been missing in peace and conflict studies. How do these reflect African developments, though? I have shown that Africans are a part of these ongoing discussions, as suggested by the wide array of approaches referred to. I'm sure you will agree with me that they are also a part of the policy shifts or policy failures that have led to these debates. Finally, as Africans, we have been privy to the shifts in warfare and experienced the possibilities of peace processes that keep us vested in these debates. This now leads me to turn to the section on epistemic justice for peace and development, revisiting the archives, because they allow for a refocusing of the sources of knowledge production to apply to African contexts and address African concerns of peace and development. 3. Epistemic justice for peace and development, revisiting the archives. The shifts through emerging theoretical perspectives and contributions I have provided in detail carry some practical possibilities to inch further away from epistemic violence towards epistemic justice, and I have identified a set of 4 to discuss with you today. 1. Especially focusing on the people who experience and exercise various forms of violence should provide an outlook how violence in the past has been and may in the future be overcome. This does not absolve those in positions of power of their responsibility, but rather ensures that any change envisioned is sufficiently accountable and responsive to the needs on the ground. Coupling the social movements within which people organize to the injustice and violence they identify unleashes a media of inquiry with regard to the scholarship on this topic. Freedom and emancipation as kindred values are not the enterprise of political parties or governments alone, even though their promises of delivering these should serve as a point of reference. It should come as no surprise that structural asymmetries, among them the North-South divide and gendered violence, belong to the predominant forms of violence experienced within the global South. They displace regional blocks, national boundaries, and social categories, even as they reverberate within each other. 2. Next to the political persecution of individuals and political movements regarded as oppositional, marginalization and erasure from history has been the mainstay of autocratic regimes. They oftentimes, like the South African government of the pre-1994 era, view themselves as being in a war of survival and mete out physical violence to accompany the structural violence they exert. How then can we encounter this from within an African academy? It stands to reason that revisiting the archives provides an entry point to untying these enmeshed forms of violence. It is in this moment that the task of historiography as a corrective finds its place within peace and conflict studies, namely to debunk such premises about specific genders, countries, and regions, but more importantly, to reinscribe those on the margins of the field, to return to them the agency, the definitional power, and the acknowledgement as fully fledged human subjects they showed when taking on the task of persuasion and mediation, when taking on the responsibility of political power, or when embarking on peace activism and resistance. This is what takes me back into Women's Month and to my very first publication. We would be remiss not to acknowledge the march to the Union buildings, the Defiance campaign and the general rollout of anti-pass protests, or the Sharpeville massacres, alongside movements for Black consciousness, or the 1976 student uprisings in this vein. They've all been included as a part of South African feminist histories and as milestones of African histories through projects such as the Women Writing Africa series, that on the heels of the Women Writing in India series could become a part of a global project. There's a long history of women and resistance in Africa, and their contributions have been the subject for feminist discovery. One need only refer to Judith Van Allen, Cheryl Walker, or Nomboniso Gasa to remind us of this. Yet, whose history and what memory could fulfill the task of reinscribing from the margins? In this instance, it would be the Archive of Resistance that needs to be consulted and excavated for its gendered, racialized fractures. The decolonial argument that has been to chiefly show that there are essential gaps in the canon, thereby rendering the Eurocentric bias an intentional omission. Its critique of epistemic violence calls for a decolonization of individual disciplines and the university as a whole, according to Ndlovu Gajeni. Anthony Angie does so for third world approaches to international law. Robert Vitalis recoups the Howard School on the margins of American IR, and Jean Allman follows suit for African studies, where she incites whether #Herskovits must fall. 3. Linda Carty and Chandra Talpade Mohanty complete this picture for the case of feminisms by creating an archive of social justice movements through the lens of eminent feminists, in relation to the Global South. They explain that, and I quote, "Archiving these stories, then, is a political project about challenging mainstream narratives of feminism, of communism, and the left, and mapping the complexity of identity-based social movements and of intellectual and political work in the academy." Close quote. The freedom warriors they write about remind us of the freedom fighters of a different era, whose ideals pushed for a different society. Like Amitav Archaya and Pam Manchilian, these authors that I'm referring to here, namely Archaya, Pam Manchilian, take the ideal of freedom quite literally by exploring the Bandung Conference. They insist that it belongs to the study of IR as a lineage of struggle, and thereby extend its relevance beyond the Global South and find its place in a field that ought to strive for global resonance rather than universal truth. A fourth possibility that I only briefly touch on but elaborate in the written paper is through the increasingly popular use of imaginaries such as folk-tales, anecdotes, and parables that serve as analogies for real-life worlds and material realities. These imaginaries are imbricated into the memories of those who have been marginalized and excluded from positions of power, and more specifically from the bookshelves, lecture halls, and hallways of academic knowledge production. They speak to those disciplines and sub-disciplines, like peace and conflict studies, which situate themselves in the international order. Peace junctures and their legacies. In this final substantive section, I shift towards peace junctures or perennial topics as they carry the potential to influence the field into the future. It does not follow the progressive flow of peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace building, but may variably be applied to these. The trio of peace junctures further invites empirical, theoretical, and/or methodological reflection in future. The first peace juncture may be found in the arenas of transitional justice as a transformation from armed conflict to a sustainable peace is an arduous process. Restorative justice may not be equated to criminal justice, political justice, or even gender justice. Whether locally or internationally, whether from the perspective of perpetrators of violence or those who were witnesses and survivors thereof, and whether from civil society or the state, it remains a contested area. Different justice conceptions abound within them, including liberal and indigenous conceptions. This at the same time that erstwhile political opponents and gendered preconceptions meet on each other. Permeating legal institutions and political agreements is therefore neither a straightforward nor easy task, precisely because of the foundations that are lodged within them. The second peace juncture relates to Africa and the Global South. If they regard themselves as belonging to an international society of states or community, to regional or international organizations and networks of solidarity, then the summits and conferences within which representatives of states and social justice movements gather are peace junctures too. At these summits and conferences, leaders agree on principles, politics, and policies that guide their actions or act along guidelines they defend. On the one hand, such platforms function as a means through which the international may be reclaimed for Africans and people from the Global South, as during the Bandung Conference above. On the other hand, Babatunde Obamamoye makes a strong case for the continued existence of the liberal order across the continent when he seeks African agency in liberal peace interventions. In a similar fashion, that it permeates nation-states and disciplines discussed previously, he cautions that it serves as an ordering framework for African regional actors and international organizations too. Despite the best possible intentions, international peace missions habitually stall or fail, and that is a reality that even then President Sangoa and African leaders had to realize. It takes a certain power of imagination to even conceptualize that peace negotiations have easy outcomes. More importantly, though, peacemakers and peacekeepers' motivations for attempting such a daunting task signal aspirations that should be located abroad and at home. Local dynamics thus resonate in the form of the personas, the political agendas, the social structures, and the philosophical approaches that carry them. The final peace juncture I leave you with is related to these local dynamics because of the methodological challenges that accompany them. If, like in the Bandung Conference, as Aida Hosic realizes, save for one exception, there were no women present, then how do such platforms serve to shape the political identities of those who have avowedly shared their values and even pride themselves in popularizing these? Her example is illuminating because the majority of African women will not belong to an official delegation or feature in the political histories of such events. In this regard, we are at a different point today, and women's participation will surely not reach such a low point again. However, gender issues will oftentimes not receive the same attention or resources as other issues. They will also not be dealt with as comprehensively as maybe the ideal of peace activists, feminist, or allied movements. Appreciating which women are able to take up these rare opportunities and turn them into popular instruments may well be a prospect to unlocking their influence on peace processes, on North-South relations as international conflicts, and the conflicts within solidarity-based relations in the Global South. This would imply that as part and parcel of the imaginaries referred to above, one would have to value the biographies, literatures, and oral histories associated with them. Heidi Hudson does this as a case in point. It would also necessitate absorbing the continuities between sociocultural forms of organization and political expression, as has been the domain of standpoint or Busadi theorizations. In a complementary sense, the version of this peace juncture that I have embarked on is to venture into women's arenas in the international order for the powerful contestations that take place within them. How ideas travel, their dialogues that manifest such ideas, and the experiences that lead to appeals of more inclusive, more just policies and frameworks governing social and sustainable peace remain a transformative peace studies mainstay. Peace and conflict find themselves within the politics between women because women are not more peaceable than men, and because the conflicts of the world are the conflicts of women too. And now I close with the concluding remarks. In today's lecture, I have shared with you outlines of an equality and equity-oriented peace and conflict studies, which builds on feminist inspirations and draws on insights that reject colonialism in its entirety. It is an entry point that aims to position African developments of political histories and struggles for peace. It is indeed true that African problems require African solutions, as much as stubborn and persistent structures require multi-pronged approaches. We should be prepared to encounter failures, pushbacks, and stalemates in our quest for more inclusive and conducive environments. Are we bold enough to stand up to the new challenges of the new era? Perhaps the renewals of previous international agendas to our current inhospitable environment may provide the glimpse of the hope we seek. For now, we are left with anticipation of marking African successes where we find them, to revel in the solidarities we experience, and to never languish in the omissions we admonish. If nothing else, then the summarized send-off from today's lecture should be: peace is always negotiated. As the ultimate goal, it is nevertheless non-negotiable. Thank you.
Good morning or afternoon. I would like to start with thanking Professor Motsamadikane, Vice Principal for Teaching, Learning, Community Engagement and Student Support, and Professor Vilne Como, Executive Dean of the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, for inviting me to respond to Professor Magise Bartel's inaugural lecture. It's really a great pleasure and privilege to be with you today and to join the University of South Africa's intellectual community at such an important occasion. Professor Magise Bartel and I have known each other for many years, and throughout those years, we have engaged in many conversations and have collaborated and continue to do so as editors of the Routledge book series, Gender in a Global Local World, as well as of the journal Third World Quarterly, which is one of the most well-known and recognized journals addressing critical issues for, of, and in the Global South. Our multiple interactions have been extremely fruitful, and I think that we both have benefited from them, as they have enriched our understandings of peace and development, feminist post- and decolonial scholarship, including transnational feminisms. It's without a doubt that Professor Magise Bartel has made and continues to make an important contribution to peace and development studies. She's a forceful and authoritative voice, and her manifold theoretical and policy-related contributions have made a significant impact on the field, in particular through her scholarship on transnational feminist engagement with norms and normativities, on transitional democracy in relation to peace and development, and in terms of her reflections on post-colonial theory. Please allow me to highlight Professor Magise Bartel's impressive trajectory in my present talk. In her book, Mobilizing Transnational Gender Politics in Post-Genocide Rwanda, she addresses how global gender norms shape local debates and interventions by women and feminists. While these latter groups also strategically use global norms to advance their own agendas. Her analysis draws in part on a feminist constructivist perspective through a post-colonial lens, revealing that global gender norms and rules are not static, but are undergoing re-articulations as they're being put into practice in local contexts and vice versa. She thus unpacks the intricate mechanisms how of how global gender norms are being not only put into practice locally, but are being also transformed, and these global gender norms are being transformed in the process. This all occurs through a transnational and national strategies pursued by feminist and women's organizations in their search for gender equality. As such, her detailed analysis is much more than a theoretical informed case study and is providing important insights for scholars interested in development issues, global governance, and democratic transition processes in Africa and beyond. For instance, it resonates with the work of Keck and Sikkink on transnational organizing and my own work on femicides in Mexico, which studies how local, transborder, and transnational women's organizations and feminist groups have navigated regional and global governance mechanisms in order to force Mexican federal, state, and local authorities to seriously and fully address the impunity which has surrounded these femicides. Professor Magisa Bartel's scholarship also engages with post-colonial feminist literature that critically analyzes how intersecting mechanisms of colonialism, class, race, sexuality, and gender result in and compound inequalities. She joins Floria Anthias, Nir Yuval Davis, Gayatri Spivak, Judith Butler, and many others who demonstrate how the nation is inscribed on women's bodies in particular. In the words of Anthias and Yuval Davis, gender serves as a boundary marker and a boundary maker in defining nation and national identities. And, as feminist peace activists and their academic counterparts have argued, women's bodies have become strategically important for warfare and peace. As Professor Magisa Bartel has just suggested in her lecture, African voices, in particular African women's and feminist voices, are indispensable for generating sustainable and equitable peace in the region and beyond. More recently, and building on her work about Rwanda, Professor Magisa Bartel has taken a critical post-colonial perspective to the role of the Global South and South-South cooperation in the ongoing transformation of the Western-based global order. Focusing on African-Chinese relations and cooperation, she argues that this trans-regional cooperation needs to be understood in terms of its third worldist legacy, which informs the Global South's geographical and epistemological constitution. The Bandung Conference amounts to a constitutive turning point in the articulation of third worldism, which is based on the foundational principles of anti-colonialism and anti-racism, as she argues in her forthcoming chapter, which will be published in the third edition of Gender and Global Restructuring, Sightings, Sites, and Resistances, edited by Professor Anne Sisson-Runyon and myself. In her analysis of 21st century cooperation between Africa and China, Professor Magisa Bartel emphasizes the role of gender activists in contemporary Africa-Chinese cooperation and other instances of South-South cooperation, such as the BRICS, suggesting that they struggle for a non-androcentric, multipolar world. Professor Magisa Bartel's intellectual trajectory and reflections constitute a major contribution to the field of peace and development studies, as they reveal how a gender-inclusive approach provides a more comprehensive understanding of the world around us and of how global and local actions are intertwined and multidimensional. As such, Professor Magisa Bartel's contributions are important for a broad-based audience that is not very well familiarized or versed with feminist scholarship in peace and development studies. Let me reflect for a moment on the present conjuncture. in which we find ourselves. With the widespread rise in authoritarian, often right-wing national populism, with the increased tensions between the US and China, with the war in the Ukraine, with the global ecological crisis, among other problems and challenges that we're facing. Returning to what Professor Magisa Bartel wrote in 2015, and I quote, "I show that international norms have mattered for gender politics in African countries and also explain how this is so. By explicating the link between domestic and international politics, the wide range of tools used in gender equality lobbying becomes visible, as do the shared hurdles faced by gender equality proponents," unquote. For me, her astute observations in 2015 raise a set of questions about the present conjuncture. For instance, given the aforementioned rise in authoritarian nationalist populism, are gender equality proponents now facing shared hurdles in the form of a backlash against gender equality and international norms in general, which are perceived by such groups as affecting national sovereignty? What can we learn from the strategies developed by women and feminist organizations in Rwanda to address such hurdles? Could we use some of these strategies to counter or contest this backlash? These new realities in some parts of the global South and global North, I should add, raise the questions of how sustainable are international gender norms nowadays. Do we need a renewed engagement with norms and normativities in which African and other global South women's and feminist voices are pivotal? The war in the Ukraine poses another dilemma for the global South and North, as it has already triggered the early signs of a re-emergent Cold War with its geopolitical implications. What would this entail for the global South, and in particular Africa, geopolitically, in terms of food security, but also epistemologically? Do we need to revisit the foundational principles of the Bandung Conference? What would it mean for South-South cooperation and China's geopolitical role? Will the eventual peace negotiations heed global UN-based gender norms as reflected in the UN Security Council Resolution 1325? Although the usual actors, the US, the UK, NATO, have played an important role in the conflict, in addition, obviously, to the warring parties, several actors or countries from the global South have also been involved in trying to bring the parties to the negotiating table. This is why we need to pay attention to the upcoming BRICS meeting in South Africa and analyze how the BRICS are not only navigating the present global geopolitical conjuncture, but also how they are responding to the demands of the BRICS Feminist Watch. Professor Magisa Bartel's analyses about South-South cooperation, transitional justice norms, and peace and development will provide insights into the complexities of these processes. In sum, I'm looking forward to Professor Magisa Bartel's future engagement with such issues. Her unique voice will bring much needed insights to our conversations about these and other pranging issues. Finally, as I've shown, Professor Magisa Bartel's insightful contributions to the field of peace and development studies have been very well received by her peers. Generally, her thoughtful analyses have engaged a large interdisciplinary audience, and her many roles in the International Studies Association, as well as the role as editor of Third World Quarterly, are evidence of her standing within the broader or larger academic community. It is therefore with great pleasure that I welcome Professor Magisa Bartel into the Professoriate of International Relations, and in particular as Professor of Peace and Development Studies. My warmest congratulations, Rehandu, and Godspeed on the intellectual and academic journey ahead, or as they say in Spanish, enhorabuena. Thank you.
Congratulations, congratulations, and more congratulations to you, Prof, for this achievement. As a university, we are truly proud of you, and we want to join your family and your peers in the academe to say, well done. It is my honor to say to you, welcome aboard the community of scholars. Congratulations again. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of this event. I wish to say on behalf of the Vice Chancellor of the University of South Africa, thank you for joining us. And I want to wish Prof. Mageza Barthel all the best for the future. Good night to you all. Siyabonga kakhulu. Bye.